June 3, 1942. A sweltering intelligence office in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Corporal William "Billy" Thornton sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese messages, his fingers turning a rusty bolt over and over in his hands, while the other codebreakers watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. The bolt was his thinking tool, his meditation device, a piece of junk he had carried since childhood that everyone in the office considered proof of his eccentricity. For 3 weeks, the American cryptanalysis teams had been struggling with a new Japanese naval cipher. The messages were flooding in, intercepts from radio stations across the Pacific, but no one could crack them. The Japanese had changed their encoding system after the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the new cipher was proving impenetrable. Every technique the professionals had tried had failed. Billy was not a professional. He was a 23-year-old farm boy from Nebraska who had been assigned to the intelligence unit because he scored unusually high on pattern recognition tests. He had no formal training in cryptography, no mathematical background, no credentials that would impress the university professors and career intelligence officers who staffed the code-breaking operation. He was a nobody, a clerk, a man who played with rusty bolts while geniuses struggled with the fate of the Pacific War. But Billy had been staring at those messages for 19 days, turning his bolt, letting his mind wander through the patterns the way he used to wander through the cornfields back home. And on the morning of June 3rd, he saw something that changed everything. The bolt had 13 threads. The Japanese cipher repeated its key sequence every 13 characters. It was not a coincidence, it was not a guess. It was a pattern that Billy's strange, wandering mind had finally recognized, a pattern that the professionals had missed because they were looking for something more sophisticated, something worthy of their expertise. Billy grabbed a pencil and began to write. The first message decoded in 11 minutes, the second in 8. By noon he had cracked 7 messages, and the senior officers were gathering around his desk with expressions that had shifted from contempt to astonishment. By the end of the week, Billy Thornton would decode 53 Japanese naval messages, revealing the Imperial Navy's plans for a decisive battle near a tiny atoll called Midway. The information would allow Admiral Nimitz to position his carriers perfectly, ambushing the Japanese fleet in what would become the turning point of the Pacific War. And it all started with a rusty bolt that everyone had mocked. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal how the smallest things can change history, how one person's unconventional thinking can turn the tide of war. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. These stories survive because we remember them together. William James Thornton was born in 1919 on a small farm outside the town of Broken Bow, Nebraska, in the heart of the Sandhills region, where the grass rolled like ocean waves and the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away across endless prairie. His father, James Thornton, was a farmer who had inherited the land from his father, working the same fields that had sustained the family for 3 generations through drought and depression and every hardship the Great Plains could throw at them. His mother, Martha, was a schoolteacher who had given up her career to raise children on the isolated prairie, bringing her love of learning to a place where books were rare and education was a luxury few could afford. Billy was different from other children, and everyone knew it from the time he could walk. He did not play the way other boys played, did not run and shout and wrestle in the dust. Instead, he would sit for hours watching the patterns of wind in the grass, the movements of birds across the sky, the way shadows shifted as the sun moved overhead. His eyes would lose focus, his mind would drift, and he would enter a state that his mother called Billy's thinking time, and that everyone else called evidence of a troubled mind. He collected things obsessively, rocks, feathers, bits of metal, anything that caught his wandering attention, and arranged them in patterns that made sense only to him. The other children called him strange. The adults called him touched in the head. But Billy's mother saw something different. She saw a mind that worked in ways other minds did not, that perceived connections invisible to normal perception. She nurtured his gift, teaching him to read at 4, to do arithmetic at 5, to recognize patterns in everything from weather to wildlife to the strange marks on the pages of books. The rusty bolt came into Billy's life when he was 7 years old, on a summer afternoon that would shape everything that followed. He found it in the barn, half buried in the dirt floor, a remnant of some long-forgotten piece of equipment that had rusted and crumbled decades before Billy was born. Most children would have discarded it without a second thought, but Billy was fascinated by the spiral of the threads, by the mathematical precision that had created such a simple object. He cleaned the bolt carefully with a rag, counted its 13 threads with the attention of a scientist examining a specimen, measured the pitch and spacing with a ruler borrowed from his mother's sewing box. From that day forward, he carried the bolt everywhere he went, turning it in his fingers whenever he needed to think. The bolt became his thinking tool, his meditation device, his connection to a calm center that his wandering mind otherwise lacked. When Billy needed to concentrate, when his wandering mind threatened to scatter in too many directions, he would turn the bolt in his fingers and let the spiral guide his thoughts. The threads became a pathway, a track that his mind could follow while the rest of him stayed calm and focused. His mother understood. His father tolerated it. The neighbors whispered about the strange Thornton boy who played with junk instead of doing normal things. But Billy kept turning the bolt, kept seeing patterns, kept developing a gift that would one day save thousands of lives. In school, Billy excelled at subjects that involved pattern recognition, mathematics, music, languages, and struggled with everything else. He could memorize the irregular verbs of Latin in an afternoon, but could not remember to bring his lunch. He could solve complex equations that stumped his teachers, but could not follow the rules of baseball. His grades were erratic, brilliant in some areas and failing in others, and his teachers did not know what to make of him. When he graduated high school in 1937, there was no money for college, and even if there had been, Billy was not suited for the structured environment of higher education. He returned to the farm, working alongside his father, tending crops and livestock, while his mind continued to wander through patterns that no one else could see. The war changed everything. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Billy enlisted immediately. He was 22 years old, healthy and strong from years of farm work, and he felt the same patriotic duty that pulled millions of young men toward the recruiting stations in the weeks after December 7th. He expected to be sent to infantry, to carry a rifle, to fight in the way that farmers' sons had always fought in America's wars. Instead, the Army gave him a test. The armed services had begun using standardized tests to identify special aptitudes among the flood of new recruits, trying to match individual abilities with the military's diverse needs. The tests measured various cognitive abilities: verbal reasoning, mathematical skill, spatial perception, mechanical comprehension, and something called pattern recognition that most recruits had never heard of. Most soldiers scored average on these tests and were assigned accordingly, funneled into infantry or artillery or supply units based on their general competence. A few scored exceptionally high in specific areas and were flagged for specialized training: language schools, technical programs, intelligence work. Billy Thornton scored in the 99th percentile on pattern recognition. The test administrators had never seen anything quite like it. They gave him additional tests, more complex patterns, sequences that were designed to challenge professional mathematicians. Billy solved them with casual ease, turning his rusty bolt in his fingers, while his mind worked through connections that seemed obvious to him and incomprehensible to everyone else. The administrators did not know exactly what to do with him. His other scores were unremarkable: average verbal ability, average mathematical computation, average everything except for this one extraordinary gift. They considered sending him to a code school, but his lack of formal education seemed like a handicap. They considered assigning him to a signals unit, but he had no technical training. In the end, they sent him to the intelligence center at Pearl Harbor, where the Navy and Army were jointly running one of the most important operations of the war, the effort to break Japanese codes. Billy arrived in Hawaii in March 1942, a farm boy from Nebraska who had never seen the ocean, never traveled more than 50 miles from home, never imagined that he would find himself at the center of a secret war fought with numbers and symbols rather than bullets and bombs. The tropical heat was oppressive, the humidity suffocating, the crowded military installation overwhelming for someone who had grown up with 5 miles of empty prairie between himself and the nearest neighbor. The codebreakers at Pearl Harbor were a strange collection of academics, linguists, and career intelligence officers gathered from universities and government agencies across the country. Many of them had been recruited from places like MIT and Harvard, men with advanced degrees in mathematics and linguistics who understood the theoretical foundations of cryptography in ways that Billy could barely imagine. They worked in cramped offices filled with filing cabinets and adding machines, surrounded by mountains of paper, analyzing intercepted Japanese messages and trying to find the patterns that would unlock their secrets. Billy was assigned to a support role, filing documents and organizing intercepts, because no one quite knew what else to do with him. He had no training, no credentials, no standing among the educated professionals who ran the operation. His high test scores were noted in his file but not taken seriously. What could a farm boy from Nebraska possibly contribute to the work of professional cryptanalysts? But Billy watched. He listened. He learned. And he kept turning his rusty bolt. The Japanese naval codes were among the most sophisticated in the world, developed by cryptographers who understood that the security of their empire depended on keeping their communications secret. The Imperial Navy used a system called JN-25, a complex cipher that involved both substitution and transposition of the original messages. The system worked in layers. First, the original Japanese text was converted to numbers using a codebook. Then, those numbers were scrambled using an additive book that changed the values according to complex rules. Finally, the scrambled numbers were grouped and transmitted by radio. Breaking the cipher required working backward through all of these layers, a process that could take weeks or months even with significant resources. The Americans had made significant progress against earlier versions of JN-25, achieving partial breaks that provided valuable intelligence about Japanese intentions. But after the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the Japanese implemented a new version of the cipher, JN-25C, that rendered all previous work obsolete. The new cipher was a nightmare for the American codebreakers. The substitution tables had been completely changed. The transposition patterns were different. The additive books that scrambled the final messages had been replaced. Everything the codebreakers thought they knew about JN-25 was suddenly useless. The intercepts kept coming, hundreds of messages every day captured by radio stations across the Pacific, transmitted to Pearl Harbor for analysis. But without the ability to decode them, the messages were just noise, streams of meaningless numbers that might contain the most important intelligence of the war or might contain nothing at all. The professional codebreakers attacked the problem with every technique they knew. They analyzed frequency distributions, looking for the statistical patterns that betrayed substitution ciphers. They searched for cribs, known or suspected phrases that might appear in the messages, and provide a starting point for analysis. They worked 18-hour days, filling blackboards with equations and hypotheses, slowly making progress, but not nearly fast enough. The Japanese were planning something, everyone knew it. The volume of encrypted traffic had increased dramatically, suggesting preparations for a major operation. Admiral Nimitz needed to know what was coming, where it was coming, and when it would happen. The entire Pacific strategy depended on breaking the new cipher. Billy Thornton watched all of this from his desk in the corner, filing documents and organizing intercepts. He was not supposed to work on the cipher itself, that was the job of the professionals, but he could not help looking at the messages as they passed through his hands. He could not help noticing patterns. The professionals were looking for mathematical patterns, statistical regularities, that would reveal the structure of the cipher. They were approaching the problem the way trained cryptanalysts approached problems, with sophisticated techniques and theoretical frameworks. Billy approached it differently. He did not understand the mathematics of cryptography. He did not know the theoretical frameworks. He just looked at the messages and let his mind wander, turning his rusty bolt, waiting for patterns to emerge. After 3 weeks, he saw something. The insight came on the morning of June 3, 1942, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the intelligence office was nearly empty. Billy was at his desk early, before most of the other workers had arrived, turning his bolt and staring at a stack of intercepts that had come in overnight. The messages were just columns of numbers, 5-digit groups arranged in rows, meaningless without the key to decode them. He had been staring at similar stacks for weeks, letting his mind wander through the patterns while the professionals struggled with their sophisticated techniques. But on this morning, as Billy's eyes wandered across the page, as his fingers traced the familiar 13 threads of his bolt, something clicked in his pattern-seeking mind. It was not a logical deduction, not a step-by-step process of reasoning. It was a perception, a recognition, a sudden awareness of structure that had been invisible a moment before. 13. The key repeated every 13 characters. He could not have explained how he knew this. The knowledge came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. It was not a logical deduction, not a mathematical proof. It was a perception, a recognition, the same kind of intuitive leap that had allowed him to see patterns in the grass and the wind and the movements of birds across the Nebraska sky. But once he saw it, he could not unsee it. The structure of the cipher was suddenly visible to him, the way a hidden image becomes visible in a stereogram once your eyes find the right focus. The 13-character key cycle was not perfect. There were variations and complications, but it was the foundation, the skeleton around which everything else was built. Billy grabbed a pencil and began to work. He did not use the sophisticated techniques of the professional code breakers. He did not have the training for that. Instead, he used his pattern recognition, his ability to see connections that others missed, his strange, wandering mind that had been considered a defect his entire life. The first message decoded in 11 minutes. It was a supply report from a Japanese destroyer, listing fuel and ammunition quantities, not strategically important, but proof that Billy's insight was correct. The second message decoded in 8 minutes, the third in 6. With each success, Billy refined his understanding of the cipher structure, mapped more of the substitution table, identified more of the patterns that governed the transposition. By noon, he had decoded 7 messages. Word had spread through the intelligence office, and senior officers were gathering around his desk, watching the farm boy from Nebraska do what their professional cryptanalysts had failed to do. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, the head of the code-breaking operation, pushed through the crowd and demanded to know what was happening. When he saw Billy's work, the decoded messages, the notes showing the cipher structure, the breakthrough that had eluded his best people, his expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe. "How did you figure this out?" Rochefort asked. Billy held up his rusty bolt, the thinking tool that everyone had mocked. 13 threads, he said, same as the key cycle. It was not a scientific explanation. It was not the kind of answer that would appear in a textbook on cryptanalysis, but it was the truth. Billy's strange mind had made a connection between the physical object he had carried since childhood and the abstract structure of a Japanese naval cipher. Rochefort did not care about the explanation. He cared about results. "Get this man whatever he needs," he ordered, "and get everyone else working on verification." Over the next 7 days, Billy Thornton decoded 53 Japanese naval messages. He worked almost without stopping, sleeping only when exhaustion forced him to collapse at his desk, eating whatever food his colleagues brought him while his hands continued to write. The professional code breakers worked alongside him now, using his breakthrough to accelerate their own efforts, verifying his results, and extending his techniques to new categories of messages. The entire intelligence office had been transformed by Billy's discovery, the skepticism and dismissiveness replaced by urgent cooperation, as everyone recognized what was at stake. The intelligence that emerged from those decoded messages was staggering in its implications. Message after message revealed pieces of the Japanese plan. They were preparing for a major offensive, an operation that would involve most of the Imperial Navy's carrier force, the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The target was an island in the Central Pacific, a place that appeared in the messages only as AF. The attack would come in early June, probably around the 4th or 5th. The Japanese were confident of success, expecting to catch the Americans by surprise, just as they had done at Pearl Harbor. But where exactly was AF? The American analysts suspected it was Midway Atoll, a tiny American base located roughly halfway between Hawaii and Japan. Midway was strategically vital. if the Japanese captured it, they would have a forward base for further operations against Hawaii itself. But suspecting was not the same as knowing, and Admiral Nimitz needed certainty before he could commit his outnumbered carriers to a defensive battle. Billy provided the certainty. Among the messages he decoded was one that mentioned AF in connection with water supply problems. The analysts devised a clever test. They had the garrison at Midway send an unencrypted message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Billy decoded a Japanese message reporting that AF was having problems with its water supply. Midway was the target. There could be no doubt. Armed with this intelligence, Admiral Nimitz positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, hidden from Japanese reconnaissance, waiting to ambush the enemy fleet when it appeared. The Japanese expected to catch the Americans by surprise. Instead, they sailed into a trap. The Battle of Midway, fought on June 4th through 7th, 1942, was a catastrophic defeat for Japan and a turning point that would echo through the rest of the 20th century. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with a heavy cruiser and hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen died in the battle. The elite pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had swept across the Pacific with apparent invincibility, were gone. The momentum of the Pacific War shifted permanently in America's favor on those 4 days in June. Historians would later call Midway the turning point, the moment when Japan's expansion was stopped and the long road to Allied victory began. The Japanese would never again mount a major offensive operation. They would spend the rest of the war defending the conquests they had already made, slowly losing ground to American forces that grew stronger with every passing month. And it all depended on the intelligence that Billy Thornton had extracted from those 53 messages, intelligence that revealed the Japanese plan, confirmed the target, and allowed the American ambush to succeed. The codebreakers at Pearl Harbor received a unit commendation for their work. Individual names were not mentioned. The entire operation was classified and would remain so for decades. But within the intelligence community, word spread about the farm boy from Nebraska who had seen what the professionals had missed, who had broken a cipher with a rusty bolt and a strange wandering mind that no one had thought was worth anything. Billy Thornton served in the intelligence community for the remainder of the war, working on Japanese codes and ciphers that continued to evolve as the conflict progressed. He was never a leader, never a commander, never the kind of man who gave orders or formulated strategy. He remained what he had always been, a quiet, strange, brilliant individual who saw patterns that others could not see, who thought in ways that others could not understand. He worked at his desk, turned his bolt, decoded messages, and let the professionals make decisions about what to do with the intelligence he provided. The war took him to new locations as the American advance pushed westward across the Pacific. He worked in Australia, in the Philippines, in locations that remained classified for decades after the fighting stopped. Everywhere he went, he brought his pattern-seeking mind and his rusty bolt, and everywhere he went he found ways to contribute that no one else could match. The war ended in August 1945, and Billy returned to Nebraska. He had seen things during the war that he could never discuss, had contributed to victories that he could never claim credit for publicly, had carried secrets that would remain classified for 30 years after the fighting stopped, but none of that changed who he was fundamentally. A farm boy who saw patterns, who thought differently, who had never quite fit into the world that everyone else inhabited. He took over his father's farm after the old man died in 1947, returning to the land that had shaped him, to the endless prairie where his strange mind had first learned to see patterns in the wind and the grass. He married a local woman named Dorothy, who understood his strangeness and loved him anyway, who had grown up in the same small town and remembered the strange Thornton boy who played with junk instead of doing normal things. Together, they raised 3 children in the farmhouse where Billy had grown up, surrounded by the rolling grass and endless sky of the Nebraska sandhills. Billy never stopped seeing patterns. He saw them in the weather, predicting droughts and storms with uncanny accuracy that his neighbors attributed to luck, but that Billy knew came from the same gift that had broken the Japanese cipher. He saw them in crop yields, knowing exactly when to plant and harvest for maximum production. He saw them in the movements of cattle and the growth of grass and the thousand small variables that determined whether a farm succeeded or failed. And he kept turning his rusty bolt, the thinking tool that had carried him through the most important work of his life, the simple object that connected everything he had been to everything he had become. In 1982, when the records of the Pearl Harbor code-breaking operation were finally declassified after 40 years of secrecy, a historian researching the Battle of Midway tracked Billy down at his farm in Nebraska. The historian had found references in the archives to an enlisted man who had achieved an important breakthrough in the JN-25C cipher, and he wanted to interview the man responsible for one of the most significant intelligence achievements of the war. Billy agreed reluctantly. He was 63 years old, weathered by decades of farm work, his hands roughened by years of handling equipment and livestock, uncomfortable with attention that he had never sought or wanted. But he understood that history deserved to be recorded, that the people who had fought and worked and died in the war deserved to have their stories told accurately. The interview lasted 5 hours, conducted in the kitchen of the farmhouse where Billy had been born. Billy explained his process, or tried to explain it, though much of what he did remained mysterious even to him, a gift he had never fully understood. He described the moment when the 13-thread pattern clicked into place, the week of frantic decoding that followed, the intelligence that had helped win the Battle of Midway and perhaps changed the course of world history. At the end, the historian asked the question that everyone eventually asked: how did a farm boy with no training see what professional cryptanalysts could not? Billy turned his rusty bolt in his fingers, feeling the familiar spiral of the threads. "I don't think like they think," he said finally. "My mind wanders. It makes connections that don't make sense to other people. All my life that was a problem. I was strange, I was touched, I was the weird kid who played with junk." He held up the bolt, showing the historian the 13 threads that had been worn smooth by 40 years of constant handling. But sometimes, the strange way is the right way. Sometimes the connections that don't make sense are the ones that matter most. The professionals were looking for mathematical patterns. I don't know what I was looking for, just patterns. Any patterns. And I found one that they missed. He set the bolt on the table between them. 13 threads, that's all it was. 13 threads on a rusty bolt and 13 characters in a cipher key. My mind made the connection. I don't know how, I don't know why, but it worked. And because it worked, we knew the Japanese were coming to Midway. And because we knew, we won. Billy Thornton died in 1996, at the age of 77, peacefully in his sleep on a spring night when the Nebraska wind was blowing soft and warm across the prairie. He was buried in the small cemetery outside Broken Bow, within sight of the farm where he had grown up, surrounded by the rolling grass that had been his first teacher in the art of seeing patterns. His children and grandchildren gathered to remember a quiet man who had never sought attention, who had spent most of his life working the land, who had carried a rusty bolt in his pocket for 70 years. The obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service, but did not specify what he had done. The details remained too obscure for a small-town journalist to find, buried in archives that few people knew how to access. Only his family knew the full story, the secret he had kept for decades, the week in June 1942, when a strange farm boy from Nebraska had cracked 53 Japanese codes and helped change the course of history. The rusty bolt was buried with him, placed in his hand by his eldest son, who understood that it belonged with Billy in a way that transcended mere sentiment. They had mocked his rusty bolt decoder. They had called him strange, touched, not quite right in the head. They had dismissed him as a clerk, a file organizer, a nobody among geniuses who understood mathematics and cryptography, in ways he never would. And then they had watched him crack 53 Japanese codes in a single week, using nothing but a rusty bolt and a pattern-seeking mind that no one had understood or valued until it mattered most. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments what touched you most and tell us where you're watching from today. These stories survive when we remember them together, and together we ensure that the unconventional minds that changed history are never forgotten. The people who mocked Billy Thornton were not fools. They were educated professionals who understood cryptography far better than a farm boy from Nebraska ever would. They approached problems the way trained experts approach problems, with sophisticated techniques and theoretical frameworks and years of accumulated knowledge. But Billy understood something they did not, something he could never quite explain, something about patterns and connections and the strange, wandering paths that his mind followed when everyone else was walking straight lines. Sometimes the strange way is the right way. Sometimes the connections that don't make sense are the ones that matter most. And sometimes a rusty bolt with 13 threads is exactly what you need to crack a cipher that no one else can break. That is what Billy Thornton proved in June 1942. That is what we should remember today.